All right, let's begin. Hi, everyone. My name's Angelisa. I'm a support engineer here at CircleCI, and I'm really excited to share workflows with you and how to optimize your workflows. So we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about what workflows look like for your projects. So I just want to call out before we begin that I encourage you all to visit our docs. We've got a lot of things documented for you to view. Specifically for workflows, definitely go ahead and check out our docs on workflows. You'll find a lot of resources there, as well as example configurations, how other people use CircleCI, and different ways that you can make workflows happen for your use case. We also have our support center where our support team has written a lot of support articles for you to view, as well as our CircleCI Discuss community where you can talk with others using CircleCI as a product in a public space. So this is what we're going to go over today. We're going to go over mostly things related to workflows, right? We're going to cover what is a workflow exactly, and different types of workflows and how we can implement those in our logic and our config files, matrix jobs and how they relate to workflows, the V2 API. We've got two really great features with the V2 API that we can implement with workflows, including insights for data on our workflows, as well as triggering workflows with our V2 API, and then persisting data in workflows. So that involves things such as caching, using artifacts and workspaces. And then at the end of this presentation, we'll have a Q&A where I've got two of my teammates here, Hannah and Anna, and they're going to field some questions. So anytime throughout the webinar, if you think of something, feel free to just type it in that Q&A box, and Anna and Hannah are going to field those out. At the end, we'll also have our customer success team sending out links to this particular webinar and the slides. So you'll see that I'm sharing a lot of links to documentation. Don't feel like you have to screenshot those or type them out or write them down. We'll share those so that you'll be able to just click right through. But most of our docs are also pretty good in terms of searchability. So also feel free to type in CircleCI caching into Google and it'll most likely surface to the top. So right here, I also wanted to just call out some things that are helpful to know as we run through the webinar. Some things that will be helpful is just knowing how to manage source code. You are most likely an engineer and you know how to work with your source code. And so we want to make it pretty straightforward that you kind of have an understanding of how to use your source code and how that will be for your particular use case. So kind of thinking of your specific use case and how these features could then work with what you're doing with your team, as well as a working knowledge of editing YAML files. We use YAML in our config file, so it's always great to have some working knowledge of that, but we do share a lot of syntax info and tips and tricks in our docs. And then finally, your CircleCI plan details. With workflows, sometimes it does require a higher container limit. So if you're on the container plan, you may have some limitations to what you can and can't do with workflows. So that's also something to keep in mind. So what is a workflow? A workflow is just a set of rules that define a dependency graph for your jobs. It enables more features that you can call for multiple jobs and allows you to rerun the entire set of jobs at once rather than having to run individual jobs. So this is really great for automation. You can go ahead and have a job run and then another job followed by that automatically without having to trigger it manually each time. Pretty much a workflow is what can run when and how. So here's some different workflow types. We do have quite a bit, but these two really stand out to me, which are the sequential workflow, which runs a singular job in succession. So once that running job passes, the next job that you put in your logic to run will begin. If a job fails within that workflow, the entire workflow will actually fail. So as you can see here, we've got the build job first. Once build completes, we've got this requires key that says test one can run once build has completed. Then once test one completes, test two can run. And then finally, Deploy can run once 2 is completed. So as you can see, it's sequential starting from build all the way to deploy. And then we've got fan in, fan out, which is actually very similar to sequential, but rather than running the tests in succession, we've got these tests running in parallel. So we've got the build job starting first, and then followed by both test 1 and test 2 require build. So they're actually running at the same time. So this does allow for a faster workflow run. And then these parallel jobs will then lead into one singular job, and in this case being deploy. So similar to the sequential workflow starting with build, ending with deploy, we'll have test 1 and test 2 run, and once they pass, deploy can then run. We do have a lot of other workflow types, so definitely check out our docs. We've got nightly workflows, workflows with manual approval, where you do have to click yes, run, filtering by branch or Git tags, as well as context for your different GitHub or Bitbucket teams. So definitely look at the options and what works best for you. Next is matrix jobs. So before matrix jobs, if we wanted a comprehensive test suite, we would have to write on the job level, this platform, this version, and then next job, this platform, this version, next job. But now we have matrix jobs, which is a new feature on CircleCI, which a lot of people who are familiar with CI/CD have wanted. So here they are. With matrix jobs, you can now just call the matrix key in the workflows level with the versions and the platforms that you want, and CircleCI will take care of the rest for you. So it can serve a variety of use cases, and it allows a more complex config without a very cluttered config file. So definitely check out our docs. I've also included a really awesome blog post by one of our engineers, and there is a video just going and taking a deeper dive into matrix jobs. Next is the V2 API. So 2 parts of the V2 API. The first being the Insights API. So we've got 4 endpoints related to our Insights API. 2 of those are about recent runs, both on the workflow level and the job level, as well as summary metrics, again, on the workflow level and the job level. So I just did one example for the recent runs for a workflow. So this is what the endpoint looks like. We're doing a GET request to our insights for the project slug specific to a workflow name. So in my example, I'm going to request some insights on CircleCI's CircleCI docs repo, specifically our build deploy project. So this is what a project slug is. I've kind of matched the colors here for you to see. The project slug is pretty much the VCS, so in this case, GH for GitHub, BB for Bitbucket, then the org, repo, and then followed by the workflow name. So you definitely want to know what the name of the workflow is in order to get this data. But it returns some really great things in the payload, such as the workflow ID, the status of the workflow. So this workflow has passed successfully, all the jobs have run with a green build, the duration of the workflow's entire run, when it was created and when it was stopped. So these are recorded in UTC. And then credits used. And credits used is really great for those on the performance plan to understand how long did that workflow take and how many credits were used. You know, what does that look like? So if you need to share this information with other teams or within your team, just to kind of optimize, you can use this information to help you out with that. All right, next is triggering pipelines with the V2 API. So a second feature of the V2 API. So now with 2.1 configurations on CircleCI, we have what's called a pipeline. And a pipeline is pretty much the top level, collects all of the workflows within one configuration file. And within those workflows, we've got our jobs to run. Like this one, we've got my test job. But sometimes we don't want all of the workflows to run at the same time. We want maybe a workflow to run once a condition has passed. So we can use conditional workflows in that case. And that's done by using pipeline parameters, which we have now in CircleCI, to set parameters, and they're pretty much environment variables to then use for your logic with this when step. So conditionally, they will run if these parameters are met based on what we're looking for. So in my case, I've set the run integration test parameter as a Boolean to default false, meaning this workflow is not going to run because it says when false. So when false, my jobs won't run. But I can use the API then to make this request, and it's a post request to trigger the pipeline to CircleCI. I would do that project slug again that I mentioned, the gh/organization/repo. And then I'll also include in the body the parameter. So here I'm calling that run integration test parameter that I defined in my config, but I'm setting it to true now. So then once I request this, make this API request, it'll actually change this parameter to true. So it'll say when true, run my test job. So it'll run this entire integrations test workflow. Definitely check out the docs on these. I think pipeline variables are so great. We also have some that are actually included in addition that you don't have to call in your config. So definitely read up on those. You can also use other types like strings and get really creative with tagging and whatnot. So these are really, really great in both 2.1 and V2 API. And then finally is sharing data among your workflows. So I'm going to go over 3 ways, as I mentioned, which is caching, artifacts, and workspaces. The first is cache. And so if you are using a lot of fetch operations for external dependencies, you definitely want to consider caching. It pretty much persists data between the same job in your different workflow jobs. So in this example right here in this graphic, we've got our test job, and we're going to go ahead and save that cache for each test job in different workflows. And that really helps us reuse that data and save money and time with these expensive fetch operations. And they are global within a project. So if you save a cache on one branch, it will be used by your other branches. So definitely keep that in mind. And these caches are immutable. So if you want to delete a cache, for example, you're actually going to just increment your cache key from version 1 to V2 and so on. So definitely keep that in mind that you can't delete your cache, but you can always increment upwards to get a new fresh slate. Next is artifacts. So we can also persist our data after the workflow completes. So in this graphic, you can see this main workflow ran, it did the build job, test, deploy, and at the bottom, we've got our artifact. So we can keep that artifact to hold on to important files for longer term storage with certain outputs that you want to keep related to your build process. A lot of our customers use artifacts to save to S3 to reference later or to Artifactory, but saving and restoring artifacts are a really great way to share data among workflows regarding the entire job or the entire workflow. And then finally is workspaces. So this actually moves data in between jobs within one workflow. So from the build job, you'll use the workspace to bring that data down into the test job, followed by the deploy job. So these aren't shared between workflows unless you're rerunning the workflows, but otherwise the workspace is saved, you attach the workspace, it goes through that workflow, and then once the workflow has completed successfully, then the workspace will no longer be used. We also have a really awesome blog post about deep diving into workspaces, so check that out. So that's pretty much it. Just a really brief overview of some of the things we've got offered, especially when you're looking at the performance plan with 2.1 configurations, with the V2 API. These are really great features that we want you, and we encourage you to use in CircleCI. So definitely let us know if you have questions or if you have anything specific to your use case. Hopefully we can try and help you out.
Thanks, Angelisa. We have some questions from the Q&A.
Awesome.
Yeah, so our first question from James is regarding the fan in, fan out workflows where jobs are run in parallel. Is it more cost efficient to configure the workflow to run 2 build jobs concurrently?
It is.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it is, but what's happening is you're actually paying for 2 containers, right? And so that's the time use. Depending on what plan you are, let's say you're on the container plan and you have 4 allotted containers, what's gonna happen is you're gonna have your build job run, and that build job's only gonna take 1 of the 4, right? And then you're gonna, with the container plan, you're paying for all 4 regardless. So those are already accounted for. And then you've got your 2, say, test jobs running, because those happen once build has completed, then those 2 will run in parallel. and then they'll be completed. Let's say you had 5 tests, but you only have 4 containers. That last test is actually going to get queued and it will have to wait in order to run. So one of the tests will have to complete and then it can finally run. So that's something to keep in mind. But if you are on the performance plan, you're just paying for compute, right? So you're paying for credits per minute. And so if you have 5 jobs, right? You're just going to spin up all 5 at once and pay for each of the credits that are consumed for each. In terms of time, they'll all run at the same time. So you're not waiting for anything to be queued. So they'll just be able to happen faster in the workflow overall.
Our second question is, how can I make a cleanup job that will run after fan in, even if one of the parallel jobs fails?
Oh, that might be interesting to use the V2 API to trigger a new workflow to do a separate cleanup step. I'd be curious to see what exactly you're trying to achieve, but definitely look at the V2 API and seeing how you can trigger a cleanup step regardless of whether a job fails. So that's kind of separate to that. But again, it really depends if there are certain things needed within your cleanup step that are dependent on other jobs to run, especially if it does fail, that might interact with it in a not so good way where it might be repeated steps. So check out that V2 API. If you still are confused, reach out to support or discuss. There's some conversation about it. It's still a very new feature that I want to encourage people to use. So yeah, let us know.
Hey, Angelisa. So we had a couple of questions from when you were sharing the YAML, and they're a little bit related. The first question was, is there a best practice when sharing reusable? So change in parallel, meaning I'm serially and running in parallel scripts for Circle and running locally. And then a related question is, if I have 10 services and 10 different repositories, all needing to have the same workflows, is there any way to have the CircleCI config file as a Git submodule in each Git repository, or shall I update them all in case of a need to update one? So I think there are general questions about how to reuse a config and how to share reusable parts of a config.
Yeah, that is a good question. How to share reusable parts of the config.
Yeah, it might be a good time to talk about orbs.
Yeah, I was thinking of, oh gosh, what else am I thinking of? Orbs is really great. So Anna mentioned orbs, which are reusable configs that you could actually upload to the CircleCI orb registry for use. And it is pretty much like a package manager. So it's like downloading the orb as a package of commands to be run. And so that's a really great way to run certain commands. And I know there's, Slack orbs, which help notify you to let you know once a workflow or a job is completed. So it can call out to external third-party services, or it can review or check out your code depending on what you're hoping to do. I don't remember what else I was going to think of, but there's also, different ways to reuse parts of your configuration as an inline orb as well. So you can actually write the orb within your config itself. And so you're not calling to the orb over a network, but you're actually writing that logic and then it's just being reused within the config. That's also an option. I don't know. What do you think, Anna or Hannah? I feel like I'm missing something here.
I think that makes a lot of sense. So orbs are like packages so that you can have your reusable config and use them across multiple projects. And then you could even have inline orbs, so parts of your config that you can reuse later. So things like different executors, jobs, if you want to just pass in parameters and reuse them later. That's kind of the best way to keep things dry across multiple projects.
Yeah, definitely. And there are certified orbs. We have a really great partner team, and they work with other organizations to create orbs. So check out our orb registry. We also have some videos and documentation on orbs, so definitely check that out. I'd be curious to see what the customer success team has on orbs too, if anyone's interested in learning more.
Yeah, we also have a big section in our docs about reusable configs. So
that's reusable configs, which is kind of like an inline orb, but yeah, it's reusing different parts that you've kind of already instantiated in the top levels of your config that you could use throughout your configuration file.
Yeah, our next question is, is there a way to run certain workflows and steps in them on a local dev machine? Are you able to run your config locally?
Can we? That's a good
Yes, you can. You can run your jobs
yeah.
locally with the CLI command, and you would just use CircleCI local execute.
Yes, thank you.
It's helpful to note, though, you can't run the entire workflow locally. You can only run individual jobs locally. So you'd have to specify the job.
Right. Also, if you're using variables that CircleCI creates, like build number or things that are specific to us that we've created, like branch within like a pipeline parameter, they might not be usable because they don't quite exist yet. They happen during the spin up steps of a container when it's actually run on CircleCI.
Hey, Angela, so we have a question about the API. Someone is asking if the Insights API is public or do you need some auth token?
So you will need an auth token. I did not include that in my call, right? So you'll definitely need an auth token. So you're going to want to get an API token, and we do have docs on that. So check the docs, but you'll want an API token, and you're just going to pass the token through. Ideally, if you want to save it as an environment variable or part of a context, then you won't have to pass it if you are using it within your config. So you can actually save those on CircleCI. What else was I going to say about that? You can also, if you are logged in to CircleCI on your account, you can actually also type this request in, and you won't need an auth token. You should just be able to view the insights in the browser window. But yes, you'll definitely need a token for that.
Our next question is about workspaces. How long is storing and restoring workspace supposed to take? This particular client is seeing times around 1 minute quite often.
Oh, interesting. I wonder if you have a lot of dependencies. It also might vary on if you're using Docker or what kind of container what kind of image you're using. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd like to learn more about why it's taking 1 minute.
So it all depends on what you're putting in your workspace too, right? Like,
yeah.
Essentially what's happening is we encrypt and decrypt all of that data that you're saving to a workspace, and then we upload it to an S3 bucket, and that's how we're persisting it. And so it just depends, not just, but one of the primary things that it depends on is the size of your workspace. One thing that we recommend is compressing the contents that you're going to put into your workspace so that the amount of data that's being encrypted, decrypted, pulled down from the network is much smaller.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Thank you, Anna.
Hey, Angela, so we have another API question. Somebody was asking, is there any way I can look into how frequently individual end-to-end tests fail? And I can go ahead and answer this too, if you'd like.
Yeah, go ahead.
We do have an API endpoint to get the test metadata. I will make sure that in the follow-up, they include that endpoint so that you can take a look there and sort of, programmatically call that and pull that endpoint to create reports for your own purpose, for checking which tests are flaky.
Our next question is, how do I add a Slack notification to my workflow so my team can get updates on failed or successful builds without having to be logged in and viewing the CircleCI dashboard? Angelisa?
Yeah, so we used to have Slack notifications as part of an integration with CircleCI, but it didn't really lend itself to a lot of manual configuration and customization. So we now have a Slack orb. So if you go to our CircleCI orb registry, you can actually use the Slack orb to notify yourself or your team when jobs have passed or failed. It's kind of dependent too on how you set it up. So that that orb can be customized in any way that you need.
Cool. On that note of like questions about pipelines, is it somebody who's asking if it's possible to have multiple jobs in a workflow run on the same host? So they have a bunch of tasks that they want to run that aren't codependent on each other, but then when they split them up, a lot of the time is consumed in that spin up step. So they're wondering if there's a possible way to take away the spin up step. Yeah. Or to use the same spin up across all their jobs. I think that the answer here is no.
Yeah.
One
thing that you can do is you can pretty much look at your past configs and see the image that's being spun up, and there's actually a commit, or there's a SHA attached to the image, and so that is kind of pulling up. You would use that long string, so it'd be like CircleCI, a CircleCI image / node, and then the SHA attached with that, and that would be that very particular image, and then you can use that and call that image on the executor level. I worry though, because that does it's a little bit hard to maintain your versioning once you start doing that. So it is a little bit faster for the spin up step, but you're kind of looking at older versions of the image. And if you are making, or if you're using newer versions of other dependencies, that might cause conflicts. So if it's something that you're not making much changes to, you can consider looking at the spin up environment step and pulling that entire image string and reusing that. But yeah, just know that it can be a little bit dangerous if you're using other dependencies and upgrading them as you go.
Also about pipelines, is it possible to use more than one conditional parameter?
Yeah, I haven't tried that. I think so. What do you both think?
Yeah, you can. We also were looking at some more conditional logic, which allows you to nest conditional workflows.
Yeah, definitely. I don't see that being a conflict unless, of course, they are opposing. Then it's not going to allow it to run because it would just, cancel each other out. But that shouldn't be an issue. And we also have pipeline parameters that are already set within CircleCI. So, those can be useful too if you want to, create certain parameters based on branches as well as tags or anything within your spin up step.
We have a couple of related pipelines questions actually about triggering and canceling pipelines. So I'll just go through both of them. But the first question was, can I cancel all parallel jobs if one fails? So I think this is a question about the fan in, fan out workflow. It takes a bit of footwork, but you can have, so we have these one steps, which means run this job when something fails, passes, or always, regardless of when it fails or passes. And so you could have a one fail step in all your jobs that will call the API and cancel the entire workflow. And so that's kind of the best way to do that. And on a similar note of having a call to the API within the build trigger something, somebody asked, what's a good strategy for triggering a project's workflow from a new artifact in a separate project? So for example, they trigger a workflow in project A if project B produces a new image. In that case, your best bet would be to do a when pass. And then if it passes, then go ahead and use the API to trigger a pipeline in that other project.
Yeah.
Should we move on to product questions? Or I do see one other question in regards to cache. Why is caching so slow? For example, recovering half a gigabyte takes 40 to 120 seconds. It does vary from time to time. Is there any way to increase speed?
Yeah, definitely compressing, as Anna mentioned, will be really helpful. And then also just, potential noisy neighbors issue is always a possibility, but yeah, definitely just trying to limit the amount of things that you're caching. And if your cache is potentially getting too large, you might want to consider incrementing if it is just related to what you're using, not putting everything that you've ever used in your cache, but really limiting it to what is needed will also be helpful.
On a similar note, well, not really similar, but also in question of caching, one person asked, Dimitri asked, do you plan to create some kind of cheaper Docker cache instead of the current one? Because our current Docker layer caching solution costs about 200 credits per job.
Yeah, that would be a good question for our customer success team. So I'm definitely gonna see if they can add more info about that when they submit the slides. I don't know, do either of you know what our status is?
Yeah, we do currently have an orb that's under development that will help you, rather than using our built-in Docker layer caching, it uses a remote registry, but you would have to maintain the remote registry. But basically you can pull down a Docker image and it implements the cache from method for you so that you can use the image you pull down from the remote registry as a cache source. And so that would be free, but it does take a little bit more overhead. I will also add the link to that Docker layer caching orb for the customer success team to follow up with, to add in the follow-up email to this.
Thanks, Anna.
Jumping back to pipelines, is there a way to set up a job that runs only if changes are detected within a particular directory without requiring a Docker container to be spun up for a job?
Can you repeat the first part of the question?
Sure. Is there a way to set up a job to run only when changes are made to a particular directory without requiring a Docker container to be spun up? So upon a change within a particular directory, are we able to fire up a build without requiring a Docker container to be spun up?
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's possible. The times that I've known and seen are while it's spun up. So I'd be curious to see if there's some other option outside of CircleCI.
Yeah, I could see them adding some conditional logic on their side and then customizing CircleCI to detect a specific tag.
Yeah, definitely. Not within, because, CircleCI really only does the checkout step and looks at the code once we've already spun up the container. So we can't review changes prior, but as Hannah said, a tag is definitely a great way, or maybe even a branch if it's like a specific feature branch, depending on how you're setting it up.
And there's always the option to only build pull requests that you can use and customize.
Here's a question. I don't actually know the answer to this one, but it is interesting. And maybe Angelis or Hannah know the answer. Is there any way this is for caching, is there any way to specify a directory name with a space for the cache?
That is interesting. I wonder if they've encountered issues where they can't, and I'd be curious to see if they could send us more information about what that looks like, because I want to try it on my own. I know that at times there have been issues where certain symbols also can break things, TM, but yeah, that's a good question that I want to look into.
Yeah, it seems like they've encountered this issue where, as a result, if they try to pass in a directory name with a space, it uses the default directory. So it's definitely something that we'll look into. Thank you for bringing that up.
Our next question is about parallelism. Is it possible to split a job into n parallelism based on a script? And then there's a second part to this question. For example, you might run a script to get a list of directories or files to parallelize the job. So custom parallelization is what's being asked. Yes, it is possible to do that. You can customize parallelism a few different ways. We oftentimes see customers using parameters to do this.
We're pumping out a lot of information, so I wanted to just ask a question that somebody else also asked, which is the video going to be available after this?
Yes, we're recording it right now. I don't know when the customer success team is going to upload it, but it will be on YouTube. So check that out. And then the slides will also be emailed to all the attendees after.
And if anyone has a very specific question, feel free to write us in at support@circleci.com.
Yeah, especially if that, potential space issue with cache is, a bug on our end. I want to see if we can find a way to remedy that.
We have another question about caching, actually. It seems to be a popular topic. Is there any speed difference between Docker cache caching and workspaces and persisting to workspace? So do you want me? I'll start us off. But basically, so since Docker layer caching is actually kind of a totally different thing, it's just for caching your intermediate layers and your intermediate images. And so if the question is it, if I'm trying to cache intermediate layers, is it faster to use Docker layer caching the cache or workspaces? And I guess the answer there is it all depends. As for caching and workspaces, so workspaces, the thing where you are persisting from one job to the next, and caching where you're persisting from one pipeline to the next, they actually act very similarly on the back end. So there shouldn't be really too much, if any, of a difference between the two of them.
+1 to that.
I do see a question. Do we have any plans to provide a UI to trigger builds with various pipeline parameters?
No, but definitely submit a feature request. We have AHA, which is ideas.circleci.com, and you can submit some feature requests for us and for our product managers to view. That would be really interesting. And as we are building the new UI, any new ideas are highly encouraged to share with the team. So definitely let us know your thoughts on that, because that, would be really interesting. As far as I know, I don't think that is planned on the roadmap. I don't know if Hannah or Anna, you've seen or heard anything of that nature, but not that I know of.
Not for that feature particularly, but I could see this problem potentially being solved by running a script to customize specific pipeline parameters within your build.
Cool. So sorry, I'm just catching up. I like how many questions there are here. Okay. Here's a question. Is there any way to upload artifacts to test-perry and such? So I'm guessing if there's a way to upload artifacts to some other third-party service. And I would say there's no built-in way. What I would do first is check our certified orbs to see if we've partnered with that particular service, to see if a lot of places have worked with us to create an orb where you can just, with 1 to 3 lines, go ahead and say upload this there. Otherwise, you will have to use the API just as if you were uploading a file from your local machine to that particular platform.
And artifacts are also retrievable in the UI once they complete. So you could also view them there. But yeah, as Anna mentioned, there's no way that's kind of a package to do that.
Jumping back to using the Slack orb, is there a way to add a Slack notification to all jobs instead of manually adding it to each one, which might lead into forgetting one? Is there a way to just automatically have the notification? I guess it boils down to code reusability. And instead of having to use a key value pair, is there a way to automatically trigger a notification for each job?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd be curious to know that as well. I'm going to look into that. I don't know. Do either of you know that? I wonder too if you'd be able to do that on the pipeline level to get notifications, because that would be very useful as well.
It's a good question. I haven't played around with the Slack orb myself that much, but we can definitely look into it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know that the flexibility does exist in setting up different notifications and statuses per job. And that's why we're not executing the same key value pair on every single job.
I have a question, and this is one that I was also interested in. Dimitri asked, when will the new UI allow us to find and stop a build that has been rerun with SSH? So it turns out that in the old UI, if you do rerun build with SSH in the jobs page, you can see the builds that were running with SSH. In the new UI, those aren't actually seen at a top level. Right now, it seems like the best way to find those are either one, to go to the old UI by clicking that old experience button on the left-hand side, or two, just going back in your back browser. Just pressing the back button in your browser when it's necessary. This has been brought up to the new UI team, and I will also go ahead and put in a feature request for that.
Yeah, all the data points for that are super helpful. But you know, I think especially with the new UI coming, a lot of these requests are on the roadmap. It's just a matter of prioritizing. So definitely the more feedback we get, the more helpful it is, especially what's most useful to you all.
On the subject of feature requests, Sanjiwa also asks, are there any plans to have private orbs anytime soon?
That is definitely a known request, and that's something that yeah, the product teams are very aware of. In terms of status, I don't know. I'd be so curious to check our ideas page and see if there are any new comments on that, but I can check in with that and see what the status is on private orbs. Do either of you have inside knowledge?
I know a lot of people want it.
Yeah. Also for those, this is cloud, but for our enterprise teams wanting orbs as well. So orbs are definitely hot thing, and they're really great. And there's a lot that we can do with orbs. So definitely the more features, the better with orbs.
Circling back to using more than one conditional parameter, this question was meant for when you're using the when attribute. Are you able to use more than one conditional parameter?
That I don't know. I'm not quite sure. I've never used more than one condition. Have either of you?
Yeah. So that's the conditional logic. You can add more than one.
Okay.
This is super new though. This came out like last week or sometime in the last 2 weeks.
Yes.
So yeah, using conditional logic, you can have and statements or statements equals. Was there anything else, Anna, that I might be blanking on?
No, that seems to make sense. You can chain those together.
Yeah, you can also nest them, which is great.
And then also on the subject of requests for the new UI, somebody's asking if there's any plans to put credits used in the new UI. Since I know you pointed out that you can see it from the API, and I guess the question is whether it'll be added in the new UI. I, for one, don't know, but I do think it would be, like right now, what you can see is just the sort of large scale, so bird's eye overview of how much your team has consumed in the plans page.
Yeah, org level, but not project or job level. So that's, if not a feature request yet, we'll create one.
Our next question is about passing configuration between two projects. And the question is, what is the recommended method for passing configuration between two projects? For example, I have an infrastructure project that creates, among other, Kubernetes clusters per branch or PR, and I would like to pass on the Kubernetes config, so the kube config information to the actual software project that builds and deploys software on the cluster. On a high level, passing configuration between two projects can be achieved through using context. I'm not totally sure about the specific use case. Do either of you guys know?
Yeah, we have project level and organization. So there are different levels of environment variables that you can pass. So you can share them across multiple projects. Like Henna said, context is a nice one because it's both secure and you can use it across projects in your organization. So you would just have a key that says context, Kubernetes info. I'm not too familiar with like what the kube config file looks like and how that works. Ideally, contexts are used for, because the most common use case that we see for people wanting to share things from one project to another is some sort of like authorization token, some sort of secret. But you can certainly, if kube config can accept things as environment variables, that might be the best way to do it, is to say, pass this in as envars and then pull those envars out from the context.
Yeah, it looks like there's a second part to this question. If it can't be solved with several projects, can it be solved between workflows in a project? Per this question, absolutely. You can pass it through as an environment variable. Do you guys know of any other ways to pass configuration down within the same config or within the same workflow?
Yeah, there are also workflow level environment variables and pipeline level envars. There's a follow-up question here from Andre. If I have a config per branch, how can I pass a dynamic context? What would be interesting, I'd have to try this, is if you can pass in a parameter as the context name. So you pass in a context, you specify a context, like contexts are essentially key value stores that are named. And so you specify it with a string. And so one thing that you could do is to set a pipeline parameter where the context name is a string and then have that be the thing that's pulled down to identify which context to use. Hannah and Angelisa, do you know if all branches have access to an organization's context?
I believe so.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah, I think because contexts are attached to teams on the VCS level, that they will have access to whatever that team can view. So those are oftentimes repo specific or on the repo level. I don't know if they'd be branch specific.
Yeah, and if you come across any unique problems, feel free to shoot us an email with your specific use case and we can help you debug that.
Yeah, another option is we do provide like specific environment variables, so you can specify, you can name the context based on the branch, and then just say use the circle branch envar as the name of that context, things like that. Cool. So no questions now. Oh, we have another question about why caching takes so long. It really, yeah, it depends. Yeah.
Yeah, it will depend on, you know, what you are caching, how many dependencies you've got. Also, because caches are immutable, if you haven't incremented your cache for a long time, you're probably collecting a lot of information and having to pull it up and down, and it will be pretty significant. So definitely incrementing that key for only things that are needed. Does anyone else have tips on?
Yeah, another really helpful thing is to have fallback keys for your cache. So let's say, for example, if you're naming your cache with like, if you have an npm dependency cache that's named v1 checksum package JSON, so it's taking a hash of that dependency manifest. What you can do is add a second key, which will say v1 checksum without the v1 without the checksum package JSON. And so what that means is that the first time around, if you have a checksum package JSON, it's a hash of the contents of that file. So that means if you change even a single package, let's say you even upgrade the version of a single package, it will miss the cache completely if that's what you have as your key. But if you have a fallback key, what essentially happens is at least you get that partial cache restore, so you don't have to download all of your dependencies, and you can just get, and you still have those dependencies that you had fetched before. And so hopefully that will speed things up a little bit.
I do see a question here about, can you build, sign, publish a task? Can that be split into separate lanes? And I believe they probably mean separate jobs or steps so that each step can be invoked independently in a separate run command. So I would say that really depends. Do you need to build first, sign second, publish third? They could be broken up into 3 different steps. I don't see why they would all need to exist within the same exact step, unless there's something very specific that you're trying to achieve.
There's also the option to do, if you do just want these to run in the background simultaneously with each other, to add a background true key, in which case they'll run in the background so that, you know, step A, B, and C, B doesn't have to wait for A to complete because A is running in the background.
Definitely.
I think that's all of our questions, Angelisa.
Hooray! Well, thanks everyone who's still sticking around. If you have any other questions, reach out to the customer success team and they'll help field those. And then as Anna and Hannah were taking notes on some of the feature requests and other potential bugs or things that we want to look into, we'll definitely follow up. Also things with Docker layer caching, we'll reach out with that info. So we're not going anywhere, but we'll definitely see you all soon. Thanks for joining.